All right, well, let's talk a little bit about mobile this morning, shall we? So I do appreciate that most of you know exactly what I took this photo of and probably where, in most cases. I mean, it is pretty ubiquitous. It's hard to miss this, actually, in this country. But this is actually one of those instances where I took that photo, I'm like, okay, I need to find a way to build that into a talk. So that's sort of the genesis of this, honestly. But I thought a lot about this. When I first started developing software, this was a relatively easy thing to do. You know, we would sit down and we would argue over, whether we should use struts or whether we should use, tapestry or something like that. We'd have a very, very vigorous conversation. But then once we kind of got through that stuff, we would just sort of ask a really easy question. We'd look at the default, end user experience. We'd say, what's the resolution on their monitor? Like a 17-inch monitor, 15-inch monitor, whatever. What is the resolution? And we just go develop towards that. Now, I'm being a little glib, I'm being a little cynical there. It wasn't quite that simple, was it? I mean, there were all sorts of interesting issues we had to deal with, mostly around our good friend, the browser. Browser's fun, isn't it? You guys remember the good days between IE and Netscape? That was fun times, wasn't it? And of course, if you were building thick desktop applications, you had your good friend DLLs to deal with. I had a buddy of mine said he was developing those kind of applications in the 90s that there were periods he'd get so frustrated with trying to get this stuff to work that he'd just kind of curl up in a ball under his desk and sort of rock for a little bit until he kind of got his sanity back, and then he'd attempt to develop some more. But despite all that, the target didn't move. It just sort of sat there. And we knew, okay, that's going to be on a desk somewhere, and it's going to be about this size, and that's really all we had to worry about. That's not the world we live in now. We live in a world today full of all sorts of these little rectangles of glass. And there are all sorts of different shapes and sizes and resolutions, and we have to deal with that. We have what I'm sort of referring to as this deluge of devices. It is an unprecedented number of client devices that our systems need to now work with. And for a while, we could kind of dictate terms a little bit. That's over. We can no longer say this site optimized for, because our customers will just go to our competitors then. Say, okay, that's fine. We'll spend our money somewhere else. We don't need to give it to you. So that's really the challenge for us today, is to sort of figure out how do we handle that. Now, I'm going to throw some stats at you guys here this morning, and it isn't because I feel like I need to convince you. It's that I know in my experience, I still have to convince other people. And so inside my company, I seem to always get in these arguments with folks about, well, mobile's not really that important. And so I try to sort of dash these sort of things into my conversations with them. So I'm trying to arm you with data so that when someone tries to push back and say, it really isn't that important that we have a good mobile experience because the desktop's so much more important, you can say, oh, really? Here are some stats. Again, back in the day, all we really had to worry about was a resolution, a browser. We'd argue about a widget library, front-end technology, things of that nature. We'd have some very passionate discussions about that. That isn't where we live today. The desktop is no longer our most important constituent. And I have been referring to it as legacy now for a couple of years almost. And this really irritates people in my company. When I refer to the desktop as legacy, I kind of get these funny looks and they kind of growl at me a little bit. But it's where our customers are. Today, it's all about the mobile device. It's all about people being out in the wild somewhere wanting to interact with our services. The growth here is kind of astronomical. It's really hard to get your head wrapped around it. Android activations have been outpacing baby births for a considerable length of time now. And it was kind of a big deal when it finally sort of tipped over, but now it's like double, almost 3 times the amount. And we're talking about 1 million-ish Android devices are activated every day. There's about 300,000 kids that are born in the world every day. iPhone sales have far outstripped baby births as well. Right? And these are old numbers. I mean, this is from a while back. Now, there is a cap here somewhere. I mean, eventually we will run into that stage where, okay, new people are not buying their first smartphone anymore. But of course, that will just be replaced by people buying their 3rd, 4th, 5th, whatever it happens to be. And we'll get into a really interesting thing at that point around, are people going to switch from iOS to Android? Are people going to switch from Android to iOS? What's that going to look like? But eventually, we will finally stop this seemingly astronomical level of growth. But it is pretty stunning to me. We're talking about 300 million smartphones being sold every quarter. Every quarter, 300 million smartphones are going out the door. We've got about 1.5 billion of them floating around in the world right now. 1.5 billion. Now, one of the things that's fascinating to me about this is not every smartphone owner uses their smartphone like a smartphone. there's still a lot of folks who are like, oh, I need a new phone. And they go and they get, just give me my phone. And they don't realize that what they've been given is a computer. They think of it as a phone. They think of it as something they can just use to make phone calls and text messages. And they haven't quite gotten to that next step yet. I think it's going to be really, really interesting when those folks wake up and go, hey, wait, I can just Google that right here. I can just go look that up online right here. I have so much more than a phone in my pocket now. And that, I think, is going to be a real awakening, actually, for a lot of folks. iOS will probably hit 1 billion units either late this year or early next year. We're actually, I think it's tomorrow, Apple's going to have an event where they will give us some fresh data. So I'm very interested to see what they start saying at that point. You know, if they don't hit it in late this year, they'll certainly hit it next year. To give you kind of a historical sense of what this growth looks like, all right, in 2011, which is now hard for me to fathom 3 years ago, Apple sold more iOS devices than they'd sold Macs in the previous 28 years combined. Now, one of the things that's really interesting to me about this space, most of us kind of grew up with this PC thing. And in about 30 years, the PC went from something that didn't exist to something that has about 1 billion units floating around in the world. We've seen the exact same thing in the mobile space, except it didn't take 30 years. It took 6 or 7. So we've had this massive compression in the amount of time it took us to get to these levels. And that to me is really kind of hard to get our heads wrapped around. The challenge for us is it means we've got to essentially unlearn 30 years of learning. And so when these things first started appearing, a lot of us were like, well, where's the file system? I need a file system. Why? Why do you need access to the file system? Well, because I've always had access to the file system. Well, that's nice. That doesn't mean you actually need access to the file system. You know, and while we look at this and say, oh, this is such a dumbed down version of a computer, think about what this means for our parents. Think about what this means for people that aren't as technical as us. And we sort of take it for granted that, well, of course you can root your phone. How hard could that be? For most people, that's just crazy talk. Why would they even think about doing something like that? And so we have to appreciate that by making these things easier to use, we have dramatically increased the audience that we can reach. We've got about 500 million iTunes account out there right now, which means we've got 500 million people that have credit cards that are ready to give you money. That's a pretty powerful thing in many ways. We've got north of 800 million iOS devices that have been sold to date. Again, when we'll exactly get to a billion is kind of up in the air. We've got at least 1 billion Android devices that have been activated. And I say at least because we don't actually know how many have been activated in China or India because they don't call home to Google services. So we have kind of a rough approximation. It's probably at least another 200 million or so that don't talk to Google, so don't get reported in Google's numbers. So we're talking about an awful lot of units here. And the scale of this and just the time frame and the fact that it's so compressed is the thing that really jumps out at me. The fact that something that basically did not exist 5 years ago is now a 1 billion unit thing. That's really amazing. Now, to kind of put this in some historical context, we sit here right now in a world where there's about 1 billion Windows PCs floating around, plus or minus. There are about 2.2 billion internet users. Right, so the implications are here, we've already got a market just with smartphones that's bigger than the PC market. You could make an argument that somewhere in the neighborhood of at least half of the people who are getting online now are probably doing it with a rectangle of glass, not with a PC. And if we sort of extend this forward and we think about, all right, well, the folks that are going to come online next, the folks that are in these developing countries, are they going to all run out and buy a shiny new MacBook Pro? Or are they just going to use a rectangle of glass? I know where I'm going to put my money on that fight. Now, I know a lot of folks in the PC side of the house said, well, you know, once Windows 8 comes out, that's going to get everybody queuing up around the block. Everybody's going to go buy a new laptop. And historically, that was true. When a new version of Windows came out, people were like, hey, you know, my laptop's getting kind of old and stodgy. Probably time to replace it. And they went out and bought a new laptop that was twice as fast as their old one. We are kind of running into some of those physical limits of materials and that pesky speed of light thing. These machines just aren't getting as fast as they used to. Now, please don't tell my wife that, or she's going to ask why I need to keep replacing my laptop on a regular cadence. But if you think about it, for most people, not us, for most people, the laptop they would buy today, they're really not going to notice much of a speed bump from one they would have bought 2-3 years ago for average use. Now, if you're rendering video or you're doing big compile-y kind of things, different story. But for checking email, for checking Facebook, for most people, this computer that I have in front of me is orders of magnitudes more powerful than they will ever need. Right? So to give you a sense about this whole Windows 8 thing, Android devices in 2012 outsold Windows devices. Just Android devices, before you layer iOS on top of that. That to me is pretty amazing. If we think back historically to when Windows 95 was the new hotness, we get more iPads sold quarterly than PCs. Right? So again, we're seeing this rapid compression in the market in terms of how long it takes to hit some of these numbers. Now you look at Windows market share, and there's a lot of people in my company that still think it's 2008 or maybe 1998 or maybe even later in time. They seem kind of stuck in the past. But even as recently as 6 years ago, it was pretty reasonable to say that Microsoft had about a 95% market share. And so it's very, very reasonable to then say, we really need to develop for Microsoft Technologies because, hey, they are the 800-pound gorilla. Well, fast forward 4 years, and their market share was down to 30. Fast forward to today, and Microsoft has admitted, you know what, we really only have about 14% of the market now. Now, they're trying to spin that very positively. They're trying to say, look at this huge opportunity we have. We can only go up. People will eventually buy a Windows mobile device. We know it eventually. Please go buy a Windows mobile device. I do feel a little bad for the Windows mobile team because I do think they've put together some pretty cool stuff. I think some of their UI paradigms are really interesting, and it just, they kind of did it too little too late. I think if that would have come out maybe 2 or 3 years earlier, I think we maybe have a little different race today than we do, but can't go back and rewrite time. Here's another way of looking at this. This is a chart that Ben Evans put together. And this kind of gives you a sense of the history here. And this doesn't go all the way back to the beginning of the PC world, but just kind of this steady little uptick with PCs. And then kind of out of nowhere, here comes mobile. Here comes Apple and Android, and it doesn't take very long for them to absolutely eclipse what we have in the PC world. That's pretty crazy. So when Ben tweeted this, it was a little controversial. It's like, oh my God, sometime in the next 6 months. Well, this was almost a year ago now. We have crossed over. I'm very confident saying that. Very confident saying that. So think about that for a second. We're probably living in a world where that is a combined base that's larger. Similar kind of way of looking at that. This was another chart he put together. Ben is great. He does a lot of amazing stuff in this space. He actually used to be based here in London. Now he's on the West Coast. But you get a sense of just how quickly this has ramped up. That to me is just stunning. And it's hard for a lot of folks to kind of comprehend that because we haven't seen that before. To get that kind of a rapid growth in this space is really pretty remarkable. This chart shows the first time that just iOS devices outsold Windows PCs. So this is quarterly numbers, but it was December of last year when, oh, hey, look at that. We finally have an uptick. And I think we have a pretty strong sense of where those numbers have been going. For better or worse, Microsoft hasn't had a great run with their operating systems of late. In fact, did you guys see, I think it was last April, somebody did an April Fool's joke saying, Windows 9 too perfect going straight to Windows 10. And then I think it was 2 weeks ago or so, Windows said, oh yeah, we're skipping Windows 9, we're going straight to Windows 10. It's like, wait, really? Really? Actually, somebody told me the reason they did that is because there's a lot of scripts out there that look for Win 9, and of course looking for Windows 95, Windows 98. And so if they actually produced Windows 9, it would get caught by a lot of those scripts and not do the intended thing. The idea there would say, oh wait, this isn't supported on. And it's like, no, it is, but okay. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what somebody told me. So I will go ahead and repeat it to you as if it is fact. There's a lot of folks who have said, well, this is nice, Nate, but the growth is over. We don't have to worry about it because things are really tailing off. It isn't. It's actually accelerating, which is really hard to get your head wrapped around. Every week, 500,000 people are getting rid of their feature, aka dumb phones, and replacing them with smartphones. Now, I do wonder if at some point we'll see almost like a renaissance to dumb phones. Because for some people, I know that's actually a preference. They would rather carry something that does less. In fact, somebody just bought the Buffalo Bills, the NFL franchise, and paid $1.5 billion to purchase a franchise that's in one of the smaller markets in the U.S. And he apparently carries a flip phone. This is a guy who is a billionaire. I mean, by definition, to own an NFL franchise, you have to be a billionaire. And he does not carry a smartphone. He uses a flip phone. I thought that was kind of fascinating, actually. So I think about my parents. My parents just have flip phones, and I don't think they'd know what to do with an iPhone or an Android phone. I think they'd be very confused by that. I think they could, but I think they just sort of choose, I don't want to play in that game. But Took us about 16 years to get to sort of that first billion mark, and that was kind of a big deal. You look at the next billion. We're about a year and a half into that cycle, and the best expectation is it's going to take 3. And so what used to take 16 is now going to take 3, and then the next billion will probably come on even faster than that. Going all the way back to 2012, we had about 3.2 billion mobile subscribers in the world. 1 billion of those folks came online in the last 4 years alone. We still have another 4 billion people that aren't online yet, and they will be. So eventually this will reach almost everybody on Earth. We're already in a world now where smartphones do outnumber the PCs. And this was another one of Ben's charts that I absolutely loved. You pull out the iPad, and if you certainly add the iPad in, it would have crossed over years ago, which is again kind of hard to get your head wrapped around when you think so centrally around, well, the PC, everybody has a PC. All right, so we certainly are in that space at this point. We are already in a world where mobile devices outnumber humans. And I don't think that's terribly surprising. I mean, most of you probably have at least 1 or 2 extra phones lying around somewhere. I think in my household there are 7 phones and 2 tablets for 3 people. In fact, the last 2 years when I've gotten a new phone, my wife has now less casually mentioned it would be time to cull the herd, as she put it. She'd like to see me thin out the ranks of my technology. And I keep saying, but they're like historical artifacts. I mean, that's going to be like valuable maybe someday, like a collector or something. And she doesn't buy that argument. I think what I'm going to try to do is wait for her to like go away for a couple days, and I'll just like put them in a drawer so she can't see them. And then maybe I'll make up some kind of story about giving them away or something. But she'll probably see through that. A year ago, Apple told us they'd hit the 60 billion download mark. A year ago. Again, we're going to get some fresh numbers tomorrow. I expect this number to be quite a bit larger than that. December alone, the holiday season tends to be a very big deal for them in terms of app downloads. They saw 3 billion downloads last December alone. Now, the reason I throw that at you is because one of the arguments that I've gotten into with some of my colleagues is, well, we don't need to worry about apps because mobile web is so much better. It's all about the mobile web. Like, okay, I guess I kind of understand that, but why do people keep downloading apps then? And they're downloading it at a pretty healthy clip. So how do you explain that if everything is going to be about the mobile web? Now, it took Google a little while to kind of catch up, but at this point, we're seeing essentially parity between the 2 app stores, maybe not in terms of quality, and certainly not all apps are the same across both platforms. But it's just remarkable to me to see that curve and to see how quickly things ramped up to 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 billion. Best number I've seen lately says we're at about 150 billion downloads total. And we're probably, we're north of that at this point. But I mean, just ponder that for a second, 150 billion downloads. And by the way, that's not like downloading updates or, oh, I got a new phone, so I downloaded that app again. These are like unique downloads. And so that, again, just kind of gives you a sense of how much people love their apps. Monthly downloads outpaced McDonald's burger sales by a factor of 9. Factor of 9. And so think about that too. I mean, McDonald's maybe not the best hamburger you're ever going to get, but you know what? They sell a lot of them. People move a lot more apps than they do burgers. Think about it. A lot of people have a lot of apps on their device. Now, Nielsen put out some numbers recently. I think it's a little over 24 apps are actively used in a given month for most people. It's like 27 or something like that. So a lot of people have a lot of apps on their phones they don't actually launch. I know I certainly fall into that category. In fact, the last time I did an upgrade for my wife, she was asking me, what are all these things and why do I need them? And I kind of had to admit I didn't know what a lot of them were. You know what happens? Somebody says, oh, God, you got to check out this app. And you download it, and then you launch it once and then never think of it again. I was in an airplane sitting next to this woman, and we spent about an hour like comparing our springboards and like, is that a fun game? And just back and forth and getting different recommendations. And that's become almost entertainment for a lot of folks these days. A lot of money has been paid out. There's been a lot of chatter lately about, what are the economics of the app stores? Can you actually run a business on the App Store or not? As you see average selling price of applications dropping down to around 23 cents US, somewhere in that ballpark, this is a questionable thing. There was a bunch of blog entries over the summer about people saying, hey, I used to be an independent developer, but now I've kind of shut it down because I can't make a living there. And the most compelling thing I saw as a retort to that was, well, you still have to run a good business. It's still a business. it isn't, the gold rush is over. The guy who, ooh, look, I made this application and I made $1 million and now I have an island somewhere. That's done. But there's still an opportunity there for folks to have a thriving business if you have those skills. I think it's really interesting to look at apps versus music. Now, music downloads are really starting to tail off. As more and more people just do subscription services, the importance of music downloads is decreasing. But even when music was a bigger deal for iTunes, we were seeing about a 2-to-1 ratio in terms of downloads. That ratio is higher now, somewhat because music's trailing off, but we're still seeing that acceleration in people downloading applications. Right? It's at least a 2-to-1 ratio, if not more. US mobile usage has doubled since 2009, and it's only going up. I mean, it's amazing how impatient we've gotten. I mean, it's like, why don't I have my 5 bars of LTE? How can I possibly survive with this ancient 3G technology? I remember when I thought it was pretty cool that I could actually just get my email on my phone and I could just go to a website, and now I'm frustrated that it isn't faster. It doesn't take long for us to get very used to things. Yahoo claims about 400 million monthly mobile users. I'm not entirely sure what they claim as like an actual mobile user. I believe a lot of this is actually Yahoo weather data. Up until iOS 8, they were the default provider for Apple for all their weather information, which is interesting because all they did is repackage Weather Channel data. So now Apple's just going directly to Weather Channel. So I don't know if they'll be able to report 400 million monthly users as iOS 8 starts taking over, but I guess we'll see. More than half of Facebook's user base is mobile. Most people interact with Facebook on a mobile device. That doesn't surprise me. I know my wife, I don't think I've ever seen her use Facebook on anything other than her phone. That seems to be the most common thing. Somewhere north of 500 million people now are using that mobily. In the US, it seems like almost everybody uses Facebook on a mobile platform. It's pretty large that way. Most people have this installed on their phone. I thought it was interesting that the whole Facebook home thing never really went anywhere. That's sort of that effort to take over your home screen on your Android device. That kind of seemed to fall pretty flat. People weren't super interested in having another skin on top of Android. Amazon does an awful lot of sales on a mobile device. And to me, this is one of the really interesting aspects of these things. Luke Bluesky told this story earlier this year. He said he was grilling one day, and he noticed, oh crap, I'm out of my grill seasoning. And so on his porch while he's grilling, tongs in one hand, he just takes his phone out of his pocket, launches his Amazon app, aims it at the grill seasoning, tap, 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 puts the phone back in his pocket. The next day, the drone drops the grill seasoning off on his front door. I mean, that's borderline magic. The fact that in the past, we actually would have had to set our tongs down, go in the house, go to your computer, open it up, log on to Amazon, do the search. It's now you don't even have to break out of your train of thought. Now, there is an interesting sort of question about what does it mean that I can almost instantaneously have almost anything I want? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? But I do think that's pretty remarkable that someone say, hey, this is a really good book, and I can go tap, tap, and the book's on my phone. I put my phone back in my pocket. Not too surprising that we're moving a lot more units in this space and have been for quite a long time now. The interesting question starts happening in terms of when do we expect everyone is carrying a smartphone, or at least most people are carrying a smartphone. Depending on how you measure it, we've already crossed over at the 50% mark, so we're already over the majority. We haven't quite reached saturation yet. Saturation is basically this idea that says, when would you just expect someone has this? If you went to someone's house and they didn't have a refrigerator, that'd be a little weird, because a refrigerator is a saturated product. DVD player fits in the same category. DVD player is the current fastest innovation to reach saturation. The smartphone is going to knock it off its perch next year. So the best sort of estimates say it's going to be 2015 in the US, 2015 in the EU, which will make it the fastest innovation to reach saturation. Right? You look at the tablet market, and there's been a lot of argument, well, is it a PC? Is it a post-PC device? Does it really matter? Blah, blah, blah. It's been a year since the tablet market was smaller than the PC market. Right? So it's already larger. Even with iPad sales trailing off a little bit, it hasn't really changed that much. At the beginning of the year, there was expectations that in 2014, half of all PCs sold would be tablets. Half. So think about that next time somebody says, we can't really do anything with a tablet. I don't know about you guys, but my laptop is sitting for longer and longer periods of time unused. My iPad is almost never out of reach. I find I plug my iPad in a lot more because it's like, oh yeah, I'm running out of juice because I keep using the darn thing. And I think for a lot of folks, that's true. They can get an awful lot done on that. Somewhat self-serving, but Tim Cook has said he does about 80% of his job on an iPad. Again, somewhat self-serving since he is the CEO of the company, but still, I think for a lot of folks that's probably not an unreasonable number. Allegedly, half of all Americans own either a tablet or an e-reader. I'd be very curious to know how many actually own both. Mobile traffic for shopping is becoming a pretty dominant force. So we're getting very close to 50% now. And there's a very interesting thing that happens here. There's this psychological term called attachment theory. Basically, the gist of it is, if I had a mug and I said, how much would you pay me to take this mug away? You'd say, pound, £1.50, something like that. If I give you the mug and I say, how much would I have to pay you to get that mug back? In theory, this is the same transaction, but it isn't. Once I've given you the mug, you're now attached to it, and you are inevitably going to ask for more than if I was selling it to you. Attachment effect comes in as soon as you touch something, basically. This is why almost every shop you ever go into actually wants you to touch the merchandise, because once you've touched it, the attachment effect takes hold and you're willing to spend more on it. So they did some experiments last year around Christmas time. Let's see, does that happen when touch is on a touch device as opposed to mouse and keyboard? And it does. So basically, think about that when you're doing your Christmas shopping or shopping for someone's birthday or something. If you use your mobile device, you may end up paying more or buying more things because using your finger to touch and tap makes your brain think, oh, I already own that. It's already mine. I'm willing to spend more on it because it's mine. Right, very, very strange that kicks in. Anybody know what the most popular camera is on the photo sharing site Flickr? Is it a Canon? Is it a Nikon? Yeah, it's an iPhone. In fact, right now, I just checked actually earlier today, the top 5 are all phones. I mean, think about that. If you thought there were like deep philosophical arguments in software where brackets go, ask a photographer that's carrying Canon why they're not carrying Nikon or vice versa. And to me, the fact that the most popular camera on a photo sharing site is not a camera but a phone is pretty remarkable. Now, part of the argument here is the best camera you have is, of course, the camera you have with you. And I know for a fact I've captured many, many photos that I never would have gotten any other way except I had my phone with me because I wasn't going to bring my camera because that's crazy. Why would you bring your camera? My son actually broke our point and shoot a couple years ago. My wife and I had this debate for about 3 weeks. Do we even bother buying a new one? Because both of our phones have very good cameras in them, very good sensors, and you're starting to see a lot of technology get poured into that. In fact, somebody just announced a camera that happens to have a cell phone on it. Right? So it's optimized as a camera, but it is still a cell phone. So one of the things that this enables, though, that I think gets lost sometimes is it is so easy to share stuff now. Think about photos back when we actually had to develop them. Sharing photos was a difficult thing. You would take a bunch of photos, but most of them would probably just kind of end up dumped in the proverbial garbage somewhere. Nowadays, there are billions and billions and billions of photos that are taken and shared, every single week. My parents have gotten into this mindset now that if my son has, like a baseball game or a swimming thing or something, and I don't send them a video, not just a picture, but a video, I get nasty grams. That's kind of remarkable. I mean, 10 years ago, the idea of being able to video your kid doing something and then send it to the parents, the grandparents, that was like, what kind of magic does that take? The average person looks at their phone about 150 times a day. So that's roughly, 10 times an hour? Anybody think that's a little low? I mean, I'm very interested in the whole Apple Watch thing, but I'm also very cognizant of the fact that many, many, many people don't wear watches anymore. And a huge part of the reason why is because your phone knows what time it is. Your phone knows what time it is when you change time zones. Your phone knows what time it is when the seasons change and we spring forward or fall back. I was actually, I guess last spring when we sprung forward, I was sitting in my kitchen and I was making some coffee and I was looking at the range and I'm like, why hasn't the oven updated itself? I mean, I had this brief moment, I'm like, what is wrong with the oven? Why does it not know? And I'm like, oh, that's right, it's not actually connected to the internet. It's not a computer, it's from the Stone Age. I have to go over and update it manually. This is crazy. Now, I apologize for giving a lot of US-centric numbers. This is where my data typically comes from. But China Mobile has seen huge upticks in their data usage, huge upticks. And this is having an interesting effect on their mobile providers as well, because like many, they've grown kind of fat and lazy on charging a ridiculous amount of money for text messages, and that money is drying up as people realize, hey, wait, it's data. I can just get my buddies on an app and everybody can communicate that way. I love this tweet. So there will be more iPhones or more smartphones sold in China than there are people that live in America. So think about that the next time somebody says we don't need to really worry about our mobile experience. So I guarantee your business folks are thinking about China. So if they're thinking about China, then they sure as heck better be thinking about smartphones. About a quarter of all online sales here are coming from mobile devices, and that number's going up. BBC iPlayer numbers, more traffic is coming from tablets and PCs. That doesn't surprise me. Think about it. Tablet's a real nice layback kind of device. You want to watch a little TV. That makes perfect sense to me. Much easier than the PC. But I do think that's really interesting. And they've shown a lot of data that's pointing towards people using tablets as opposed to PCs. In the developing country, in many cases, your phone is your wallet. That's how you pay for things. Something like 60% of Kenyans now use their phone for money. Latest number I saw said about 20% of all global internet traffic right now is mobile. I believe the rest is all Netflix. Pretty sure that's how that works, right? Now again, I'm not trying to tell you this because you need to be convinced. I'm trying to arm you guys with some stats so that when you inevitably get in that discussion with someone about, well, it's really not that important. We don't really need a mobile solution. You can say, really? Well, what about the 1.5 billion smartphones out there? Do we just want to ignore all those? Because, I guess we could, but that doesn't seem like a great idea. This paints us into this picture now. We have to have a mobile solution. We can't ignore that. So a lot of us got very excited about this a few years ago and said, outstanding. I'm going to run off and learn Objective-C. I'm going to learn Dalvik. I'm going to go have a lot of fun building a mobile app. I need you to kind of hold off a little bit. Just relax. There's some things we need to talk about here. This is where things, frankly, start to get really interesting. This is where we start running smack dab into the diversity, or as I said earlier, the deluge of devices. One of the first things we need to discuss as a team is, what handsets do we want to target? That's a non-trivial question right there, gang. This is one of my favorite pictures. This team put out on their conference room table a subset of the devices that they test against. This was just the ones that would actually fit on the conference room table. Now, I've never actually bothered to count it up, but let's assume there's about 40 devices there. Let's further assume it takes you about an hour to regression test your application on each device. That implies a person week to regression test your application. That is one of the biggest things that was an eye-opener for us when we dove into this whole mobile thing is, wow, we need to spend a lot more on testing than we have in the past. Testing budgets get bigger. Development budgets get smaller. Sorry. One early Android developer looked at his logs and discovered there were almost 4,000 unique devices that were using his application. 4,000. He put together this heat map, and I thought this was really fascinating. Now, your first reaction to this, of course, is going to be, well, I really only need to worry about kind of this big quadrant over here because this is where all my big numbers are. And to a certain extent, that's true. But you still have a lot of people using your apps on those other phones, too. Can we really afford to just sort of say, we don't care about you? Now, OpenSignal has done some really interesting visualizations here. This is one they just did this summer. And very similar looking map. That shouldn't surprise you too much. And again, most of us, when confronted with this, we say, great, we're going to focus on that quadrant. Because that seems like the big hitters. That's where the numbers are. But I'd like to point out that this quadrant is about the same size. So we have to be aware of the fact that if we're going to just completely ignore that bottom quadrant, well, that's a lot of people. That's not an insignificant amount of our customer base. Now, it would be very interesting to understand, well, are those people actually going to pay us anything? Is there really any money for us in that quadrant? Maybe it does make sense for us to ignore them. But we at least need to have the conversation. We can't just sort of naively write off 25% of our users because it's inconvenient to us. This is one of the arguments I got in with one of my peers recently. His whole point was, we don't want to have multiple code bases. We can't support multiple code bases. And what I tried to convey to him, I wasn't very effective at the time, is that our customers don't care that it's inconvenient to us to support multiple operating systems. They don't care. They just want our apps to work on their phone. That's as far as it goes in their head. If that means we need 3 versions of it or 5 versions or 10, is inconsequential to them. So just because it's inconvenient to us doesn't mean we get to tell our customers, I'm sorry, we're going to give you a lesser experience because that makes our job easier. It's not how the game works. We like to refer to this as the matrix of pain. This is truly where we go to rip our hair out of our head. Then we got to start thinking about device sizes. This has been really fascinating to see how these have evolved. Unlike every other consumer electronic ever, phones are getting bigger. Now, I do think there is a limit to what someone will actually hold up next to their head without feeling like a complete idiot. But I also thought no one would ever take a picture with their iPad, and I see people taking pictures with their iPad every single day, it seems. And it's a beautiful viewfinder, I'll grant you that. But it does seem very strange that someone's holding a plate in front of their head. It's okay. Nowadays, we have to support everything from small phones all the way up to fairly large tablets. And there's this persistent rumor that Apple's going to announce like a 12-inch tablet here. Maybe that's what they're going to talk about tomorrow. And so Luke had an interesting way of putting this together. He said, we go from kind of these variants on the 4s all the way up to kind of the 5.5s. And I think Samsung has like a Galaxy Mega now that's like 6.3 inches or some crazy thing. Then we kind of get into that smallish tablet space or even the phablet space, somewhere in between, all the way up to the bigger tablets. And again, there's rampant rumors about things being on the other end of that scale. And now we get into some of these hybrid things where it's a laptop, it's a tablet, it's both. You just twist the screen or pull the screen off. There's variants on that. In fact, I was on an airplane recently where I saw a guy get around you can't use your laptop, all the way through the flight, but you can use your tablet. And so I looked over and he was using a laptop, and then I saw that he hadn't put it away, but what he'd done is turned the screen and snapped it down so it looked like a tablet, even though it was the same device as before, and the flight attendant didn't notice that, which I wouldn't expect her to, frankly. This is bad enough, but what kind of gives me nightmares is what comes after this. Because it isn't going to end there. There's inevitably something we're going to have to target next. I don't know what that's going to be. Apple's now finally announced the Apple Watch. Google has Glass, which I think eventually they will get right. Its current incarnation is far too creepy to be useful beyond certain verticals. But eventually we are going to have to confront this other thing. We've had a lot of conversations in our company about both, actually, ironically enough, Google Glass and these various car-oriented things. Apple has their, what do they call it, CarPlay, I think, and Android has a similar kind of a thing. There are applications for this. We are eventually going to have to target something like that. And just to make our lives even more miserable, some of these viewports lie about how big they are. This is actually one of the problems we have with the iPhone 6 Plus. It ends up looking like a tablet. And so if we actually use the tablet CSS for that, it looks really, really bad. OpenSignal had another way of visualizing this. They put out this thing. This is the typical Android screen sizes. This is why it's really hard to do Android first for a lot of people. It's like, where do you start? What do we focus on? What would our breakpoints even be? Now, until a month ago, the iOS screen sizes were very easy. They looked like this. Now they've got 2 more lines on there. And so that puts us into this painful situation where we've got this fragmentation. We might still have to support BlackBerry. We might have to support Windows Phone. We might have to support, a Surface, which of course isn't the table anymore. It amazes me that a company like Microsoft couldn't come up with a new name. Like they had to reuse the name. I understand like recycling is a good thing and all, but seriously, we couldn't have had like an intern come up with a new name. Now, this has not been a sales juggernaut, and they quickly replaced the Surface 1 with the Surface 2, which was quickly replaced by the Surface 3. I don't know if that's going to go anywhere, to be brutally honest with you. We certainly have some folks in my organization that think it's a pretty cool deal. I'm kind of on the fence. The consistent feedback we're getting from our folks is the hardware is very nice. The Surface Pro 3 hardware is nice. The operating system is terrible. It's just too muddled, that it doesn't know what it wants to be. And so maybe they'll get that right, maybe they won't. Maybe the Surface Pro 3 will run Windows 10, maybe it won't. It'll be very fascinating to see how that plays out. I doubt that Satya has the patience that Ballmer does. I don't think he's going to pour billions and billions of dollars down this particular rat hole just to see if it works, but we'll see. So this puts us in that situation because we have to deal with this variety of devices. We have to deal with the fact that the personal computer isn't actually personal, it's a legacy device. And I agree with Horace, developing for that is going to be just kind of a legacy thing in a few years. And I don't know if it'll necessarily be 5, but it isn't something we're going to be that concerned with in 10. Not surprisingly, PC sales keep declining. 2013 was the worst annual decline ever. Jason tweeted this quite a while ago, but I thought it was very fitting. He said, at some point, we're going to have these link to the desktop things go away. And I've thought a lot about this in relation to my son. Won't someone please think about the children? Look at the icon we use for save. Ponder the icon we use for save. Now, we all know what that means. We all understand where that icon came from. Now, my question to you is, does anyone in this room have a computer at home right now that's powered on that actually takes a floppy? Inevitably there's one or two, but most of us, and I remember when I think it was the iMac, when they first pulled out the floppy drive, like, oh, you can't possibly sell a computer without a floppy drive. Really? When was the last time you bought a computer that had a floppy drive? Better question. What do you work with on a regular basis that would even fit on a floppy drive anymore? So for our kids, this is just, the square means save for some strange reason. I gotta wonder if they're gonna have the same reaction to seeing link to the desktop. Daddy, what's the desktop? Isn't that my tablet? Isn't that my phone? What else could it possibly be? Now, we're not there yet, but we're getting close. And we're very much of the opinion these days, if you have an external facing thing, it is being used on a mobile device today. It's not 100% of your users, but it isn't 0. When we first looked at our logs, we were shocked at how high a percentage of our users were coming from a mobile device. We expected kind of like maybe low double digits, 10, 20, and it was closer to 50. And this was not optimized, which was part of our shame. The mantra we have now is what our customers want, when they want it, on whatever device they want to use. Which makes our job harder, I'm not going to lie to you. But it's very clear that's becoming a mobile device now. A lot of our customers are migrating away from their laptop and they're using their phone, they're using their tablet, because it's more convenient to them. Now, your first reaction to this might be, can I get out of this job? Is there another way I can make my living? I hear everybody needs a plumber, and plumbers charge a really high hourly rate, so maybe that's not a bad choice. We can't run away from this. We just need to accept the fact that anything that's external is going to be mobile. And even if you're in the situation where your internal customers aren't like beating down your door for a mobile app yet, they will be. One of the things we talk about a lot internally, there's been a lot of resistance from kind of our internal IT organization to make some of the changes we need in order to support mobile. And their argument is, well, where's the demand? Where are the mobile apps that you guys need to build? And our answer is, well, we only have a few now, but the floodgates are going to open. And our customers are going to demand these solutions, and they're going to want them not sometime in the next 6 years, they're going to want them in the next 6 weeks. And we want to be in a position where we can deliver on that. Now, a lot of vendors are going to come to you and they're going to say, oh, we can solve all your problems. Just come buy our product. And everything just goes away and it just magically disappears. There are no magic, fairy dust here, guys. I wish there was. I wish there was something we could just, okay, good, here's a large sum of money, and now the mobile problem is done, I'm going to go drink some coffee. Responsive web design is part of this picture. It is not the only answer here. It is one of the answers. Client-side rendering, though, this to me is as close to magic as we're going to get in this space. So instead of having my server say, here's the data, and I've helpfully wrapped it in the way to view it, we say, here's the data, I don't know how you're going to display it, because I don't know what's trying to display it. What might work perfectly fine on a television is not going to work on a phone and vice versa. And of course, powering those UIs are RESTful web services. And those RESTful web services kick back JSON, maybe Eden if you need a little richer data set than JSON can provide. But this puts us into a mode where the server's job is now data and the client's job is now display. It's the first time we really have separation of concerns here. In the past, we would do it just by discipline and by layering and just hope everybody did it right. But this forces us to actually have a separation of concerns. and puts us in a position where, okay, a new client comes along, no problem. It's just a new consumer for our existing web services. That's huge. So we'll let the client worry about whatever it needs to display on whatever size or shape it happens to be. Now, the downside here is I don't get to write one client that runs everywhere. The reuse does not come at the UI layer anymore. The reuse comes at that service tier. And frankly, that's a more reusable thing anyway, and will be over time. Everyone in this room has run into a web application that is dated. And you realize that, well, nobody will update it because that would actually take time, effort, money. So the business rules still probably apply. It just doesn't look good. So this model puts us into a situation where if we need to target a watch or glasses or a toaster, that's fine. It's a new consumer for our existing web services. This does mean our user interfaces become far more ephemeral than they ever were. And this is a hard bit for a lot of folks to swallow. Because they look at this and like, but no, I've bought the couch. I don't need to worry about that again. And we got to get out of that mindset. Building a user interface today is not like buying a couch. It's going to be outdated in weeks, months, years, not decades. So we need to be okay with the fact that there's a pretty decent chance that in a year or two, we're either going to have to replace that user interface or augment it or create a new one. I can almost guarantee you that a year or two from now, there is some other client you're going to have to build for. And we just need to be okay with that. And that's hard, right? Because for almost the entirety of software development, the UI and the services and everything is just kind of one big thing. And if you told me, well, I need to rewrite the UI, you're like, well, that means I'm rewriting the whole application. Not anymore. Not anymore. In this mindset, that's not what we're trying to do. So I can pretty much guarantee you, a year or two from now, there's going to be something new. I don't know what it's going to be. You know, I don't know if Apple Watch is going to be a juggernaut and everybody has to have one. Everybody needs to have an app for it. I don't know if Google Glass will finally get it right, or maybe it'll be like Google Contacts or something. You know, but there will be something. And even if it isn't some new revolutionary wearable type thing, somebody's going to come out with a new shape of device, a new size of device. And that's going to put us into the position where, well, shoot, we need to support that too. And even if for some strange reason we stop innovating at the size, shape boundary, somebody's going to invent a new UI framework. Somebody's going to take Angular and combine it with Backbone, and that's going to be, you know, the answer that everyone's going to have. It's going to be a cold, rainy weekend somewhere, and people are going to sit down and create a new JavaScript MV-star library. Nature of the beast. So as much as I wish I could predict the future, I can't, other than to say, I know it will be different than today. Very confident in saying that. Which means we need a very flexible approach. Or actually, I guess I could say we need a very agile approach. Right? I can use Alan's substitution rule in reverse. So, a lot of people look at responsive web design, and they think this is all they need to do. It's like, if I can get the grid to render on your tablet, I have succeeded. And that's not the way to think about it. All right? Responsive web design is important, but we need to understand why this whole concept came about in the first place. The goal here was not to give you a perfect experience. The goal here was to give people a good experience, a reasonable experience, to try to minimize the whole pan and zoom that ends up happening when you shrink everything down onto a small screen. So all we're really trying to do with responsive web design is adapt to what we have in front of us. This works really well for content. You know, so you see a lot of news sites like the Boston Globe, they were kind of one of the initial drivers of this stuff. But you notice as you crank it down, the fonts change, the widgets change, the size of things change, pictures get smaller or drop out entirely. Now, there's a really interesting argument that says, well, is this really the best way to present news? One long toilet roll paper roll of news? Somebody actually took the Boston Globe site and like printed it out in this size, and it's like 270 feet or some crazy thing, right? I'm sorry, I can't convert that to metric. I think the US is one of only like 2 countries that's not technically on the metric system. So, sorry. Here's another example. This is GitHub's training site. Again, as you shrink it down, we go from 3 columns immediately to 1. I think that's kind of interesting. The pictures get much smaller, and it's usable at those sizes. It's not perfect. You know, it's probably better in this view. You know, you kind of get maybe a little better look at what they're trying to accomplish. But it's at least workable. You're not shut out. I mean, if you remember when Flash was still kind of a big deal on the web, and that didn't run on iPhones in particular, and you'd go to a website, at least I would go to a website and it would be in Flash, and I used to really annoy the heck out of me because it's like all I'm trying to do is find your address or your phone number or your menu, and you're giving me a Flash, thing for that. Appreciate that. What we're trying to do here is give people a decent experience. So we leverage a fluid grid, remove, resize as necessary, remove or resize images as necessary, and this is all done through CSS media queries and fun stuff like that. We establish various breakpoints and say, okay, when you hit this breakpoint, switch to this CSS. You hit this breakpoint, switch to that CSS, which, let's be honest, means we use Twitter Bootstrap. Right? Most people these days, if they're not directly using Bootstrap, they're at least heavily influenced by Bootstrap. There's nothing wrong with that. There has been maybe a little bit of a backlash because in some cases it's pretty easy to, bless you, to tell when someone's using Bootstrap. And as much as I like people to do creative, interesting things, seeing some of the websites that developers have produced over the years, I would rather be able to say, oh, they're using Bootstrap than, wow, that was a unique take on that visual paradigm. Unfortunately, a lot of folks look at responsive web design as the answer. And they can basically say, okay, good, we've got that, we're done, the mobile problem is solved. It's not. I apologize for that. At the end of the day, responsive web design is a tool for consistency. The key word here is consistency. Notice that that does not say identical. It is a consistent experience. So if somebody comes to your experience on their tablet, on their phone, they're not like, wow, I have no idea who I'm doing business with. But they're not going to get the same experience as if they were on their laptop or on their PC. Now, another one of the unfortunate challenges here is we think, well, screen size is everything we need to know. It's not. One of the things that we need to be considering these days is how far away is our user from that screen? So a lot of us sort of have this mindset that, well, there's only a couple distances. There's handheld and then there's maybe on your desktop. But let's think about a TV. More and more TVs these days are interactive, smart TV kind of thing. So all of a sudden you take a 320 pixel strip. If you put that on your phone, that's about the typical phone width. That's going to be held at about 10 inches, maybe a little more than that. That's very different than sitting several feet away from your television screen. All of a sudden, that 320 pixels doesn't look so good. And so we need to think about that. We also need to consider input mechanisms. This is one of the really interesting aspects of these mobile devices. They aren't limited just to text. You can take a picture of something. You can scan something. You can use speech. I think one of the most miraculous things I've seen, there's that app where you can take a picture of a sign that's in a foreign language and it translates it for you. And if that's not living in the future, I don't know what is. Now, I have no idea how accurate that translation actually is. But think about that for a second. That's pretty remarkable. That's one of the challenges for us because we've spent 30 years in the keyboard mouse mindset. We need to unlearn that. We need to put that in the past and think about, well, what kind of interaction paradigms does this unlock for us? What can I do with location? There is an app we were talking about yesterday. It's Hotel Tonight. And one of the things that it does better than most of the other hotel sites is it assumes, well, if you're looking for a hotel, it's probably in the city you're in right now. And so instead of it asking you, well, where would you like to search for hotels, its immediate reaction is, well, where are you now? And it will show you, here's half a dozen hotels that are within, however much the search paradigm is of where you currently are. You can override that. You can go in and say, no, I'm actually searching for a hotel in New York or wherever, and that's fine. But it takes advantage of the fact that we know where you are. And for a lot of folks, that's very valuable. So you have to be very, very careful with assumptions. And you also have to plan for the fact that people transition from devices now. They start on their phone, they go to their laptop, they finish on their tablet. And we need to expect that kind of experience, that people are going to migrate from one device to another, that they're going to use these devices together. A lot of people use their phone while they're watching TV. It seems like every television show today has a freaking hashtag associated with it. Some shows even have apps associated with it. Start play on the app now. Like, they're trying to make a more immersive experience. So I'm very much of the opinion that responsive web design is cool for content, it's great for content, not so amazing for input. And that if your only goal is, look, I got the grid to render on the tablet, you probably didn't do it right. We need to think about the experience of using that, not just, oh, good, it fits. So we need to think about the experience. What always strikes me when people talk about trying to do this kind of one-size-fits-all is anytime you've ever gotten an article of clothing that says one size fits all, I would very much like to meet this all person, because I've never seen that work out well. All right? So we got to think about that with our experiences. And as I mentioned earlier, just because it's inconvenient to us to have to create 2 or 3 or 4 experiences for our customers does not mean it's the wrong thing to do. Now again, I want to stress responsive web design should be part of your strategy. It should be part of your expectation here, but it is not the end of the line. I sort of look at it as kind of like maybe step 1. The much, much more difficult problem here is for us to kind of get our heads wrapped around what is our user trying to do when they're mobile. They have a limited amount of real estate, so we can't let them do everything. What are the top 3 or 4 or 5 tasks they need to be able to accomplish while they're on the move? And let's optimize for that. Now, I know how hard it is to come to that decision. It's really difficult because our customers want everything. If the current application is going to do 50 things and you say, what does the mobile application need to do? They will tell you 50 things. And then usually throw in only better. It's my favorite requirement. It should work like the old system, only better. So we need to ask some hard questions. Well, where are they when they're going to do this? What do they need to do? Because the hard part for us is delivering the right thing at the right time, and then designing so that they can go from their phone to their tablet, back to their phone, then to their laptop, and making sure that they can use this stuff holistically. That's where it gets really hard. Now, in terms of the client-side rendering, there's been a lot of attention these days to JavaScript MV star. Now, I do want to point out that app development tends to behave an awful lot like fashion. It kind of goes back and forth. Right? We just sort of have this little pendulum that swings. And you know, I remember when I first did web apps, I thought, wow, this is so much better than the dumb clients we used to have. And it's obviously better than those thick client things that we tried to do. You know, so I was very gung-ho on the web page thing when I was doing that. And it took me a few years of building those to realize that, you know what, they're really no different than the green screens. I mean, they have certain advantages, but at the end of the day, take a step back, they're just forms with holes in them. They follow the same request-response paradigm as the mainframe does. The big win for us was, hey, look, it can scroll and we can put images on it. And we have these really neat things like the blink tag, so we can do really cool stuff and so impressive. But at the end of the day, it's basically the same concept. Now, not surprisingly, that pendulum just keeps swinging. The big difference here, of course, is that the browser is now the PC. We are targeting the browser. That in some ways frees us because it doesn't really matter what the underlying operating system is as long as the browser's there. Now, not surprisingly, these browsers are getting a lot more powerful. I mean, you look at the JavaScript engines that are running these days, they're pretty rockin' good. Now, of course, we turn around and we ask them to do a lot more. That shouldn't be too surprising. That's kind of the history of software, isn't it? It's like, you know, give me more hardware. Okay, now give me more hardware. Now give me more. Give me faster. And we just kind of keep trying to dial that knob up to 11. But you look at HTML5 and you look at some of the stuff that unlocks for us. The fact that web workers finally allow us to multi-thread our JavaScript within some restrictions. WebSockets finally allows us to have a communication channel that stays open with our server. So we don't have to keep going back and reintroduce ourselves every single frickin' time. Offline helps us when we inevitably lose our connection to the internet. That's one of the unfortunate aspects of mobile development is you are never going to have 5 bars all the time. You need to design for that. In fact, there's a kind of a growing movement today that says offline is the new mobile first. You know, offline first kind of being the way we need to think about development. And then, of course, the engine that runs these things is REST. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking, please, not JavaScript. Could it be any language other than JavaScript? I'm sorry, it is a first-class citizen today. I actually was talking to one of my teams about this kind of paradigm, and I had one group that basically said, well, we're not going to follow that architecture. I'm like, well, why not? And they said, well, we don't like JavaScript. And my jaw kind of hit the table. I'm like, well, I'm sorry, here, let me change the world for you so that it's more in the way that you wanted it to be. I wish JavaScript was better too. And it is improving. Let's be honest, it's not as bad as it used to be. But it's the hand we've been dealt. Again, just because it's inconvenient for us does not mean our customers care. That is really not their concern. So we have to get used to the fact that we're writing a lot more of it today. Now, luckily, things have gotten better here. We have a very rich tool suite in this space now, much more so than we had, even just a couple short years ago. That has gotten just drastically better. We've had a lot of luck with the various tools in that space. It opens up a lot of new, interesting possibilities for us. It gives us a lot of options we didn't have even just a few years ago. We can finally break out of this request-response paradigm, or what some people say or refer to as click and wait. Because you think about it, that's basically what we've asked our customers to do. I'd like to update this order. Okay, well, hold on a sec here. Let me go ask the server if that's okay. All right, I've gone ahead. And even with some of the fancy stuff we've done with, we'll update just this little part of the page and we'll put a little yellow fade thing on here to draw your attention, all that kind of stuff. It's still the same basic idea of just hold on, you don't be in too much of a hurry. We got to go ask the server if that's okay. The idea now is kind of turn that on its head a little bit and use this concept of asynchronous UIs. Now, anytime you hear something like that, your first question should be, well, why? Why do I want to do something different? What's wrong with the way we were doing it? A big part of the rationale here, guys, boils down to performance, or what you may argue is perceived performance. Now, I'm more or less a front-end guy. That's kind of where I live. And I've always been of the opinion that once you reach a certain level of performance, there's really no point in trying to tune it any faster than that because your customer can't perceive the difference. 200 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds, it's the same thing to our brains. It turns out I'm wrong. It turns out that milliseconds really do matter and that we can perceive at a far lower level than I ever would have anticipated. If Amazon adds a whopping 100 millisecond delay to their pages, they see sales decline by a full point. Now, when you're running at the margins they run at, that's significant. 100 milliseconds. Now, my first thought was 100 milliseconds. Who can possibly tell the difference between 100 milliseconds and 200 milliseconds? Apparently, we can. Now, whether people are actually looking at that saying, well, your site was 100 milliseconds slow today, so I didn't buy the thing I was going to buy, I doubt that. But it's just enough of an irritant that they buy less. If Yahoo sees a 400 millisecond decline, they see a 5 to 9% drop in traffic. Now, I could make a snarky comment about I didn't realize they had enough users to even notice that. I mean, does that mean Steve stopped using it one day and they called him up and checked if he was okay? I don't know. Google, though, 500 milliseconds. Now, I would argue this is finally starting to get into that perceivable range. This is where, half a second I can kind of see people noticing the difference there. This drops traffic by a full 20%. That is huge. Now, the way they figure this out, you notice that Google still only shows you 10 search results. It has always shown you 10 search results. Why not 15? Why not 20? Why not 50? Well, they tried 20 once with the expectation that, well, this will be better because we're showing you more results. This is good. And shockingly, search traffic dropped. And so they did a little investigation and they discovered, wow, serving up 20 results is half a second slower, and people leave. Thus why they've stuck with 10. Now, you've seen the evolution in Google. You all probably remember the era where you actually had to hit enter for Google to show you search results. You remember that? I mean, back, it was like Stone Age time. You had to bang a couple rocks together to actually enter a search query. That was very quickly replaced by Google Suggest, where you'd get the top 10 results matching whatever you were typing. That was kind of one of the first shots in the Ajax wars. That, of course, was very quickly replaced by Google Live, where you start typing and it instantly takes you to the search results page. You guys know what the next step in that is going to be, right? I mean, think about it. You'll go to Google and there will already be search results there. They'll just know. Don't ask how they'll know. That'll just creep you out. It'd be really weird if they actually suggested what to do. It's like, well, we noticed you had this stack trace. This is what we think you should do to fix your code. That might be a little creepy. So it turns out, guys, this performance stuff really matters. And that speeding up our application by even just 200 milliseconds can have a really big impact on our customers. So this approach, this JavaScript MV star approach, takes what we've already been doing and says, all right, well, let's put a little bit of structure on all that JavaScript. Let's take that sort of partial refresh JSON servicey thing we've been doing since the beginning of the Ajax world. Let's just go one step further. Let's take JavaScript MVC or MVVM or MVP. Let's be honest, it doesn't really matter. All right, we can have a really interesting debate about what the difference is between whatever you put at the end of that. Unless it involves a pint, I really don't think it's terribly, useful to have that conversation. Most folks today just refer to it as MV star or MV whatever, because really, honestly, the differences are too minor to get all worked up about. We take that same basic approach we've used on the server since seemingly the beginning of time, except we actually now have separation of concerns. The client's job is all about the presentation, right? So instead of having to enforce this with discipline and layering, which I always thought was kind of an obvious thing until I was working on kind of a like best practice-y sort of thing for Java developers a while back. And one of the suggestions we got was, we got to tell people not to send the HTTP session object down to the database tier. And I kind of thought to myself, well, that's pretty obvious, right? I mean, nobody would send the session object down to the database tier. And the guy I was working on this project with was like, oh, you don't understand, man. Many, many applications here are sending the actual HTTP session object all the way down to the database. Like that frightens me. But again, separation of concerns. This also gives us non-blocking UI. Now this is a really interesting twist because for the first time this allows us to decouple that request part from the user interface part. So we render the view on the client and we let it monitor all that stuff for us. All right, so instead of always having to run back to the server and say, what's my next view? The client just already has the next view. And behind the scenes, it runs off to the server and says, by the way, here's the new data. Go post this, please, to the database. Please update the database. Now, this does imply we're putting a lot more state on the client. And that's, you got to think about that. These little rectangles of glass, they're very easy to lose. So if you've got your corporate secret data on there, that might not be the best approach. But this allows us to talk to our server asynchronously, which means we update the UI, then tell the server we updated something. So it's kind of an order of operation difference. Typically what we do is the user says, I'd like to update the address or update the order or update the customer, update the policy, the account, whatever. And we say, well, hold on. Let me go check with the server. And we run off to the server and the server says, great, here's the new view to display. And we go back and we show the user and the user's like, oh, okay, finally. The idea here is the user updates the account or updates the customer or updates whatever it happens to be. And they continue on. And while they're continuing on, we run off to the server and say, here's the new data. Now that should give you pause, because your first reaction to that should be, what happens when things go wrong? Because things will go wrong. That is one of the attributes of software developers. We're very good at sort of sniffing out where things can break. Got to think about validation. It's very possible that you could send something up to the server and their server says, nope, not going to let you do that. This does imply we need to do some client-side validation. Now, just because I did my client-side validation doesn't mean we just blissfully trust whatever the client sends us. You're going to need to do that validation on the server too. That does mean we may have that validation duplicated. This is where some people get very excited about doing everything in JavaScript or everything in Clojure or everything in insert your favorite language here. I'm not as concerned about that. That doesn't cause me to lose sleep. I think it's okay for us to have a little bit of wetness there in the code base, a little lack of dry, if you want to use that acronym. It's maybe not the best thing, but I don't think it's the end of the world either. Certainly possible your server could have an issue. It could do that today, by the way. So presumably you've already got error handling in place today. You have to worry about parallel requests. It's entirely possible that somebody does 3 updates. Are they applied in the right order? It's possible that we're both trying to update the same thing. Is that something that we need to guard against? What kind of locking mechanism do we need to use? You see this kind of thing with a lot of apps today, though. If you go to Gmail and you try to navigate off of it while it's downloading your messages, it's going to say, hang on, I'm trying to do stuff. You can certainly say, I don't care. That is fine for Gmail because it's not destructive. You have to think about that in terms of how your system works. Are there times where, geez, if somebody closed the tab right now, we would be in an inconsistent state? Okay, we need to guard against that. Now, I'm not trying to pitch this as the perfect technology that everything is all unicorns and rainbows. It's not. But there are answers to a lot of these issues. Okay, so that kind of brings us back to the why part here again. Now, I want to stress that JavaScript is no longer the intern's language. I know in a lot of organizations, a lot of developers, certainly in kind of the late 90s, they ran into JavaScript and basically said, nope, not for me. This is too hard. I'm going to go do server-side coding. That's not the way we phrased it. Most of us were like, well, I'm going to do the serious work on the server. The UI work, that's for the kids. That's for, the intern to deal with. So that's not for me. I think what it really boiled down to is we looked at it and went, wow, there's no tooling here. It's really hard to be successful being a front-end developer. And so we all kind of ran back to the server where there's tools. So we do need a way to manage that. We also need to be very aware of page weights. So almost every JavaScript MVStar library fits into the lightweight category. Now this is a debatable point. Some people look at it and say that some of these libraries are too big for the mobile space. And there are some that are very, very adamant that these things need to be bare bones, minimalist, do nothing more than they absolutely need to do. Some people actually advocate, you should just roll your own because then you're only getting exactly what you need. I think that takes things a little far, but it depends on your needs. So we do need to think a lot about that. But again, it really forces us to finally have a clean separation of concerns. Client's job is display data. Server's job is present data to me. That's it. And then I figure out how to display it. Now that does turn our servers basically into JSON pumps. That is not a bad thing. This does put us in a mode where a bunch of different consumers can all talk to the same web services. And that's where the reuse is going to happen. It's at that web servers layer, not at the client UI. I'm not going to claim this will work for the next 50 years. I'm not naive enough to do that. But this is as close to future-proofing as we're going to get in this time in history. Because I have no idea what's going to be the dominant UI trend, paradigm, thing we're going to have to target in 2 years. God, I wish I did. But I know I can't predict the future. I'm very confident it's going to be different than today. Very confident. So we let the client figure out how to present the data, as opposed to having the server say, here's how to present the data. It gives us a lot more flexibility. At the end of the day, we really don't have anyone to blame here but ourselves. When you go back in time, these web app things used to be a lot easier. And we just kept kind of pushing boundaries. And that's a good thing. I remember what Amazon used to look like. I remember what a lot of these apps used to look like. They were pretty hideous. We've gotten to a point now where our customers actually have pretty high expectations of what we're able to do. I think that's great. User interface stuff matters, is great. Better user experience is a differentiator here. But again, not a silver bullet. Don't let anyone try to claim that this is going to solve every problem you've ever had, because it won't. You will eventually have something in your application that should be synchronous. Even apps that fully buy into this client rendered piece, sometimes what you'll see is the first page actually gets server rendered. Because if you've ever run into an application where it's like you go to a URL and like the screen is white for a couple seconds, and then all of a sudden a whole bunch of stuff like appears out of nowhere, that's client rendered UI, and it's just taking too long. And so usually what people will do to solve that is, okay, the first page, we're going to render that on the server and send it down so it's available to immediately, and then after that, it's all client-side render. That's what Twitter does, for example. And so you're going to find yourself in a situation where you may need some feedback somewhere. I know myself, the first time we used Ajax in anger on a project, we actually had a synchronous call back to our server. And the server didn't return XML, it returned JSON. And I know I was telling somebody that years and years ago, and they said, well, you didn't do Ajax then. I said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, Ajax, quite clearly, it's asynchronous JavaScript and XML, and you didn't do asynchronous or XML. I said, okay, I did Sajaj. Do you feel better? No, he wasn't amused by that. The other major part of this, guys, is REST. Now, what's been really fascinating to me, my organization, I work for a very conservative, traditional company, one that I'm sure Alan would call I know Alan would call non-agile. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when I would have said REST, many of my peers would have just kind of looked at me like, what are you talking about? SOAP is the only answer in the web service space. A switch flipped sometime in the last couple years. I don't know exactly when. I couldn't tell you exactly when the light bulb went off. But we've sort of done a 180 on that. And more and more of the things we're building are RESTful. And I'm very excited about that. I think that's great. I used to get in some pretty deep arguments with people about, you don't understand, for the client side, I got to have RESTful interfaces. I got to have JSON. That's not even a question anymore. It's very, very handy for me. Ultimately, guys, this is just an architectural style. And one of the reasons why it's so popular, frankly, is because it's supported on so many different operating systems and will work with so many different languages. One of the things that I find very instructive, take a look at Google, take a look at Amazon, take a look at any major website that you work with. What operating system are they hosted on? Do you care? Did you ever once think to ask? I mean, maybe, we're geeks. We're kind of curious about that stuff. Do you care what language Amazon uses to write their web services? Are they all written in the same language? Probably not. That to me is one of the really cool advances with microservices, because it finally now allows me to admit the truth, which is every company I've ever been at is not a homogeneous environment. I always get a kick out of that when someone says, well, we're a Java shop, or we're a this shop, or we're a that shop. It's like, really? Because you got a whole bunch of stuff written in this long laundry list of of technologies. Nobody's pure. You can't be. Performance is a big part of this. These things perform. They scale really, really well. And that's because they're very loosely coupled. We've got this wonderful set of well-defined error codes and response codes. Y'all can't even know what some of them mean. We were in a cab last year in, I think it was Des Moines, Iowa, of all places. And we hop in the cab, and on the little back thing says, you are in cab 404. And so we all had a good laugh at that. We're like, dude, we're in cab 404. We took a picture of it and everything. The cab driver thought we were nuts. He had no clue why we thought it was so amusing that we were in cab 404. So he clearly doesn't understand response codes. God. It's all just representation. You don't care what operating system Google uses, what language search is written in. You don't care how many different languages Google or Amazon Web Services are written in. It's actually simple, unlike that other acronym that starts with the word simple. We've got a nice set of well-known verbs. It's not the richest set. This is actually an argument Alan and I had earlier this week. Get, put, post, delete. It works. It certainly works. It's kind of understandable. Well, you want to delete something. What method might you use? Probably not get. Probably something different. It gives us true separation of concerns. I keep beating that dead horse. It gives us stateless communication. This is why it scales and performs. It doesn't matter what server you come back to. At least if we do it right, session state is supposed to live on the client, not the server. I think about almost every app I've run into where we've had issues, it's when we didn't do this. That's when we tried to maintain server state. That is where all sorts of apps go to crash. I could tell you some horror stories about teams that did some very unfortunate things with server-side state. In the perfect world, the response actually tells the client, this is how long this data is valid. Maybe it's 60 minutes, maybe it's 60 seconds. So maybe you don't actually have to go back and ask again because you know what, it's good, it hasn't really changed. It's uniform. These very nice hierarchical layers. Now, it's really interesting to talk to people about how they name some of their resources and whether or not they actually use hierarchy or not. And there's all sorts of interesting debates. One of my peers and she and I have had a lot of conversations about this as we've tried to kind of help teams sort of get up to speed on this. There's a lot of arguments over how that should actually work. But we've got very nice, clean boundaries as well. Now, it is possible within this model to actually send code down, although that always kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies, the idea of actually, here's code from the server, please execute this. Not something I strongly advise you to do. But what this does allow us to do is basically create our application as a set of resources. The hardest part here, at least from the teams I've worked with, is getting us to think in this mindset. How do we break the application domain down into a set of services? What does that look like? What does that decomp look like? In the past, it was fairly natural because it's like, well, what's the screen we're going to be displaying to the customer? Now it's, well, how should this be structured in terms of services? You have to think about it in a little different way. But it isn't that complicated. And a lot of people get all caught up on the words. It's just something that can be named. That's it. And this means it can be almost anything. Now, we need an identifier. We need a way to get that thing, which in the web world is a URI, or a Uniform Resource Identifier. Many of us just call this an address. Now, it is possible for a given resource to have multiple URIs. It's certainly feasible if you have multiple ways to get at that thing. But a URI best only return one thing. That would be bad if a URI could return multiple things. One day I give you this, one day I give you that. It's like, no, please don't do that to me. You can have an identifier actually associated with its underlying representation. So this is kind of where we get into that debate about what should be sent back. One of our teams recently created a RESTful web service that returns XML. And I don't know how to feel about that because I in general don't like XML. Their argument is basically, well, it's easy to parse. It's like, okay, I guess. I didn't really think JSON was hard to parse. And it's at least human readable or more human readable. But we have some interesting sort of legacy things to deal with there. We have a team that created this object model that everybody thinks they're supposed to use for all service endpoints, and it is causing pain. So there's unfortunately too many politics involved, too much politics involved for us to try to kill it. We've tried. But you will see sometimes where folks will actually say in terms of the URI itself, this is what I want back. You know, I want JSON, I want XML. But the beauty is we're getting some kind of an abstraction. We don't know what the underlying data looks like. We don't know what the underlying model is. We don't know what the data store is, and we don't care. You know, this again allows us to a lot of flexibility in terms of changing things. So if you're using a web service and it defines this contract, and the implementer of the web service decides, you know what, we've been using Oracle for this, but it turns out we'd be better off if we used, you know, Neo4j, to use Neil's example from earlier today. That's fine. I don't care. As long as you still obey the contract, that's great. As long as I give you this, you give me that. I don't care how you handle it. I don't care if it's squirrels putting it up in a tree. That's fine. As long as you return to me the data I'm asking for. You can get a lot of different representations back. You can actually get it as XML or JSON or something else. And it is possible for the URI itself to say, this is what I want back. So in the past, you'd actually see some cases where we would terminate the URL with JSON or XML or something. That was very, very popular in the Rails camp for a while. I would argue in general that's kind of fallen out of favor, that we're better off being a little more opaque there. You know, so instead of that being something broadcast out in the open, let's go ahead and negotiate that. You know, say, hey, this is the MIME type I'm looking for, instead of trying to jam it into the URL. Now, the thing we all have to sort of recognize is the server gets to decide what it's going to return. It's not up to us. We can ask. That doesn't mean it's going to actually do it. Now, even though I think there has been a bit of a groundswell towards REST, expect at least somebody to comment about SOAP. There will be some proponent somewhere, you might even be that person, who says, but SOAP. I actually got in an argument with one of my, actually his mentor. We were talking about one of these projects, and he was very adamant that, you know, SOAP is good, because SOAP allows me to generate the message class. And my reaction to him was basically, you know, dude, if you can't create, you know, a bean, basically, if you can't create an object with some getters and setters on it, and you can't do that in like under an hour, we got issues. You know, my biggest problem with SOAP, it puts me in a situation where as soon as I now have a service that's used by multiple consumers, if one of my consumers needs me to add just one more attribute, I have now broken every single consumer. Because I now change my message, these guys go, wait, this isn't the message format I was expecting, and they puke all over themselves. If I'm returning something more forgiving, like JSON, and one of my 5 consumers says, I really need that attribute, I add the attribute, and my other 4 consumers are not even aware I added it, it is far more forgiving to change. To me, that's where I'd like to optimize. Now, I know some people say, yeah, but you know, the parsing or the this or that. I understand, but I'm much more interested in the cost of change than I am in that initial cost of development. You know, so just because I can generate this class, well, that's nice. That isn't going to be the most expensive thing in the history of this web service. I guarantee the web service is going to change. I guarantee one of my consumers is going to want something else in the future. So how do I set myself up for that? I'm very much of the opinion that there is really nothing inside of SOAP that would qualify as the word simple. It's very ironic. I mean, just because you tried to name it that way does not actually make it so. Sorry. In fact, it's very, very heavyweight. This is another one of the points I tried to make to my peer. It's like, dude, it's not lightweight. For almost all instances of web services, it's radical overkill for what people are actually trying to do. And I don't think it's a surprise that almost all SOAP APIs that exist are deprecated or removed entirely. More and more of our vendors keep coming to us every week saying, by the way, you know that SOAP thing that we've been using? It's going away in 18 months. You need to get off it. You know, and if you just look at the broader web, almost every instance of a sort of a free, open, existing SOAP service is gone, replaced by a RESTful service. Now, you still see some argument, and this is actually where one of my peers is at. She refuses to believe that you can use REST for app-to-app communication. She thinks that REST is not appropriate there. I disagree with her on that. I think it's perfectly fine for app-to-app communication as well. I think in almost all instances where somebody said, you know, oh, but this particular thing in WS is so much better, I don't think it was ever actually used in practice. I know one of the big things that came out with the whole SOA craze was, well, your application will just go to a directory and just pick from a set of services in your application. Like every time it deploys, there'll be a new application because it'll just pick whatever service. When has that ever happened? Would you ever actually trust an app in production that you didn't actually test against that set of web services? Would you really ever let an app just randomly pick whatever service it wanted to based on some description that some developer wrote, regardless of how they wrote it? I don't care what WS thing it fit into. Well, this is our SLA. Really? We sure about that? I'm very much of the opinion that REST could work in all of those situations. I really have yet to see one where, oh yes, SOAP would truly be superior here. I suppose the only instance that I'm somewhat, I'll grudgingly agree to, we have some cases in our company where some of the REST or some of the SOAP services are protected behind a particular security token, and it's easier to create that in SOAP land. Right? So I will grant you that. But I would also argue that that was a poor choice in terms of how they chose to secure that web service. But speaking of security, a lot of people say, but how do I secure my RESTful endpoints? We can do that. Amazon does it all the time. You know, it may not be as rich as some of the things you get in WS Death Star land, but basic works, OAuth works. Please use SSL. Now, you do have to worry about cross-domain requests. This is one of the big issues we grapple with on almost every single one of our applications, how to best handle this. There are a multitude of ways. Some apps use JSON-P, so that's JSON with padding. So essentially what you do there is instead of going directly after it, you're going to wrap a function call around that payload, so it's going to get executed when it comes back. That's a little scary. Right? So the callback actually says, here's the function that you should be executing. So a script element is pointing to that resource as opposed to just, hey, resource, give me what you got. This is vulnerable. Right, so you do have to be very careful with that. I don't know that that's the most secure thing we have. You're actually seeing a lot of apps move towards CORS today, cross-origin resource sharing. That's also relatively popular. A lot of people refer to it as simply a modern alternative to JSON-P. The trick here is basically the browser tells the server, hey, you know what, I know this is coming from this domain and not that domain, but it's okay, it's cool, I meant to do that. Please allow that to happen. And so we just have to make sure we get the right headers back. Basically, all the modern browsers support that these days. You know, not all the old ones, obviously, but you know, it's relatively secure these days. Very common to proxy requests. This is probably the most common thing we do in our world. So either the request goes back to the web tier that served up the page, and then the web tier turns around and makes the call to the web service, or you go through like a load balancer or something like that to actually, you know, we do that quite a bit, actually go back to our load balancer and let it redirect to the actual web service call. So. Different apps use different techniques. Some of our apps actually use multiple techniques depending on what they're trying to talk to and where it happens to live. At the end of the day, guys, we live in a brave new world. This is very different than the kind of software we were building 10, 15, 20 years ago. It isn't going to slow down. I don't see a return to, oh, good, we just have one thing we need to worry about. It's going to get worse. I don't expect this to get any better in the next couple years. I am adamantly of the opinion that a year from now, 2 years from now, we're going to have to target something we're not even thinking about today. You know, and that's going to be a big challenge for a lot of organizations, and we need to be prepared for that. My company adopted this style 2 years ago. This has been our default for 2 years, and I work for a very conservative organization that does not like change. But we recognized as a technology community that the only way we can possibly handle what's coming is by adopting this kind of an approach. Right? We've also adopted the mantra that if it's external, it's mobile. Now, the real challenge for us is getting some of our business folks to realize this means our employees too, not just customers. Right? So we need to adapt to that. We need to be flexible or agile. See, it works there. I love it. Alan would be proud. We need to embrace the fact that our UIs are going to be ephemeral today. That's just the way it is. All right? I wish you luck. It can be done. All right, well, it is lunch, but I will certainly stick around if anybody has any questions, but I would not expect you guys to delay food. I've learned long ago, do not stand between geeks and lunch. So I appreciate your time and attention this morning, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And so it's very, very reasonable to then say, we really need to develop for Microsoft Technologies because, hey, they are the 800-pound gorilla. Well, fast forward 4 years, and their market share was down to 30. Fast forward to today, and Microsoft has admitted, you know what, we really only have about 14% of the market now. Now, they're trying to spin that very positively. They're trying to say, look at this huge opportunity we have. We can only go up. People will eventually buy a Windows mobile device. We know it. Eventually, please go buy a Windows mobile device. I do feel a little bad for the Windows mobile team because I do think they've put together some pretty cool stuff. I think some of their UI paradigms are really interesting, and it just, they kind of did it too little too late. I think if that would have come out maybe 2 or 3 years earlier, I think we maybe have a little different race today than we do, but can't go back and rewrite time. Here's another way of looking at this. This is a chart that Ben Evans put together. And this kind of gives you a sense of the history here. And this doesn't go all the way back to the beginning of the PC world, but just kind of this steady little uptick with PCs. And then kind of out of nowhere, here comes mobile. Here comes Apple and Android, and it doesn't take very long for them to absolutely eclipse what we have in the PC world. That's pretty crazy. So when Ben tweeted this, it was a little controversial. It's like, oh my God, sometime in the next 6 months. Well, this was almost a year ago now. We have crossed over. I'm very confident saying that. Very confident saying that. So think about that for a second. We're probably living in a world where that is a combined base that's larger. Similar kind of way of looking at that. This was another chart he put together. Ben is great. He does a lot of amazing stuff in this space. He actually used to be based here in London. Now he's on the West Coast. But you get a sense of just how quickly this has ramped up. That to me is just stunning. And it's hard for a lot of folks to kind of comprehend that because we haven't seen that before. To get that kind of a rapid growth in this space is really pretty remarkable. This chart shows the first time that just iOS devices outsold Windows PCs. So this is quarterly numbers, but it was December of last year when, oh hey, look at that, we finally have an uptick. And I think we have a pretty strong sense of where those numbers have been going. For better or worse, Microsoft hasn't had a great run with their operating systems of late. In fact, did you guys see, I think it was last April, somebody did an April Fool's joke saying, Windows 9 too perfect going straight to Windows 10. And then I think it was 2 weeks ago or so, Windows said, oh yeah, we're skipping Windows 9, we're going straight to Windows 10. I can just go look that up online right here. I have so much more than a phone in my pocket now. And that I think is going to be a real awakening actually for a lot of folks. iOS will probably hit 1 billion units either late this year or early next year. I think it's tomorrow, Apple's going to have an event where they will give us some fresh data. So I'm very interested to see what they start saying at that point. If they don't hit it in late this year, they'll certainly hit it next year. To give you kind of a historical sense of what this growth looks like. All right, in 2011, which is now hard for me to fathom 3 years ago, Apple sold more iOS devices than they'd sold Macs in the previous 28 years combined. Now, one of the things that's really interesting to me about this space, most of us kind of grew up with this PC thing. And in about 30 years, the PC went from something that didn't exist to something that has about 1 billion units floating around in the world. We've seen the exact same thing in the mobile space, except it didn't take 30 years. It took 6 or 7. So we've had this massive compression in the amount of time it took us to get to these levels. And that to me is really kind of hard to get our heads wrapped around. The challenge for us is it means we've got to essentially unlearn 30 years of learning. And so when these things first started appearing, a lot of us were like, well, where's the file system? I need a file system. Why? Why do you need access to the file system? Well, because I've always had access to the file system. Well, that's nice. That doesn't mean you actually need access to the file system. And while we look at this and say, oh, this is such a dumbed down version of a computer, think about what this means for our parents. Think about what this means for people that aren't as technical as us. We sort of take it for granted that, well, of course you can root your phone. How hard could that be? For most people, that's just crazy talk. Why would they even think about doing something like that? And so we have to appreciate that by making these things easier to use, we have dramatically increased the audience that we can reach. We've got about 500 million iTunes account out there right now, which means we've got 500 million people that have credit cards that are ready to give you money. That's a pretty powerful thing in many ways. We've got north of 800 million iOS devices that have been sold to date. Again, when we'll exactly get to a billion is kind of up in the air. We've got at least a billion Android devices that have been activated. And I say at least because we don't actually know how many have been activated in China or India because they don't call home to Google services. So we have kind of a rough approximation. It's probably at least another 200 million or so that don't talk to Google, so don't get reported in Google's numbers. So we're talking about an awful lot of units here. And the scale of this and just the time frame experience, I still have to convince other people. And so inside my company, I seem to always get in these arguments with folks about, well, mobile's not really that important. And so I try to sort of dash these sort of things into my conversations with them. So I'm trying to arm you with data so that when someone tries to push back and say, it really isn't that important that we have a good mobile experience because, the desktop's so much more important, you can say, oh, really? Here are some stats. Again, back in the day, all we really had to worry about was a resolution, a browser. We'd argue about a widget library, front-end technology, things of that nature. We'd have some very passionate discussions about that. That isn't where we live today. The desktop is no longer our most important constituent. And I have been referring to it as legacy now for a couple of years almost. And this really irritates people in my company. When I refer to the desktop as legacy, I kind of get these funny looks and they kind of growl at me a little bit. But it's where our customers are. Today, it's all about the mobile device. It's all about people being out in the wild somewhere wanting to interact with our services. The growth here is kind of astronomical. It's really hard to get your head wrapped around it. Android activations have been outpacing baby births for a considerable length of time now. And it was kind of a big deal when it finally sort of tipped over, but now it's like double, almost 3 times the amount. We're talking about 1 million-ish Android devices are activated every day. There's about 300,000 kids that are born in the world every day. iPhone sales have far outstripped baby births as well. Right? And these are old numbers. I mean, this is from a while back. Now, there is a cap here somewhere. I mean, eventually we will run into that stage where, okay, new people are not buying their first smartphone anymore. But of course, that will just be replaced by people buying their 3rd, 4th, 5th, whatever it happens to be. And we'll get into a really interesting thing at that point around, are people going to switch from iOS to Android? Are people going to switch from Android to iOS? What's that going to look like? But eventually we will finally stop this seemingly astronomical level of growth. But it is pretty stunning to me. We're talking about 300 million smartphones being sold every quarter. Every quarter, 300 million smartphones are going out the door. We've got about 1.5 billion of them floating around in the world right now. 1.5 billion. Now, one of the things that's fascinating to me about this is not every smartphone owner uses their smartphone like a smartphone. There's still a lot of folks who are like, oh, I need a new phone, and they go and they get, just give me my phone, and they don't realize that what they've been given is a computer. They think of it as a phone. They think of it as something they can just use to make phone calls and text messages, and they haven't quite gotten to that next step yet. I think it's going to be really, really interesting when those folks wake up and go, hey, wait, I can just Google that right here. I mean, the fact that it's so compressed is the thing that really jumps out at me. The fact that something that basically did not exist 5 years ago is now a 1 billion unit thing. That's really amazing. Now, to kind of put this in some historical context, we sit here right now in a world where there's about 1 billion Windows PCs floating around, plus or minus. There are about 2.2 billion internet users. Right, so the implications are here, we've already got a market just with smartphones that's bigger than the PC market. You could make an argument that somewhere in the neighborhood of at least half of the people who are getting online now are probably doing it with a rectangle of glass, not with a PC. And if we sort of extend this forward and we think about, all right, well, the folks that are going to come online next, the folks that are in these developing countries, are they going to all run out and buy a shiny new MacBook Pro? Or are they just going to use a rectangle of glass? I know where I'm going to put my money on that fight. Now, I know a lot of folks in the PC side of the house said, well, once Windows 8 comes out, that's going to get everybody queuing up around the block. Everybody's going to go buy a new laptop. And historically, that was true. When a new version of Windows came out, people were like, hey, my laptop's getting kind of old and stodgy. Probably time to replace it. And they went out and bought a new laptop that was twice as fast as their old one. We are kind of running into some of those physical limits of materials and that pesky speed of light thing. These machines just aren't getting as fast as they used to. Now, please don't tell my wife that, or she's going to ask why I need to keep replacing my laptop on a regular cadence. But if you think about it, for most people, not us, for most people, the laptop they would buy today, they're really not going to notice much of a speed bump from one they would have bought 2-3 years ago for average use. Now, if you're rendering video or you're doing big compile-y kind of things, different story. But for checking email, for checking Facebook, for most people, this computer that I have in front of me is orders of magnitudes more powerful than they will ever need. Right? So to give you a sense about this whole Windows 8 thing, Android devices in 2012 outsold Windows devices. Just Android devices, before you layer iOS on top of that. That to me is pretty amazing. If we think back historically to when Windows 95 was the new hotness, we get more iPads sold quarterly than PCs. Right? So again, we're seeing this rapid compression in the market in terms of how long it takes to hit some of these numbers. Now you look at Windows market share, and there's a lot of people in my company that still think it's 2008 or maybe 1998 or maybe even later in time. They seem kind of stuck in the past. But even as recently as 6 years ago, it was pretty reasonable to say that Microsoft had about a 95% market share. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about mobile this morning, shall we? So I do appreciate that most of you know exactly what I took this photo of and probably where in most cases. I mean, it is pretty ubiquitous. It's hard to miss this actually in this country. But this is actually one of those instances where I took that photo. I'm like, okay, I need to find a way to build that into a talk. So that's sort of the genesis of this, honestly. But I thought a lot about this. When I first started developing software, this was a relatively easy thing to do. We would sit down and we would argue over, whether we should use struts or whether we should use, tapestry or something like that. We'd have a very, very vigorous conversation. But then once we kind of got through that stuff, we would just sort of ask a really easy question. We'd look at the default, end user experience. We'd say, what's the resolution on their monitor? Like a 17-inch monitor, 15-inch monitor, whatever. What is the resolution? And we just go develop towards that. Now, I'm being a little glib, I'm being a little cynical there. It wasn't quite that simple, was it? I mean, there were all sorts of interesting issues we had to deal with, mostly around our good friend, the browser. Browser's fun, isn't it? You guys remember the good days between IE and Netscape? That was fun times, wasn't it? And of course, if you were building thick desktop applications, you had your good friend DLLs to deal with. I had a buddy of mine said he was developing those kind of applications in the 90s that there were periods he'd get so frustrated with trying to get this stuff to work that he'd just kind of curl up in a ball under his desk and sort of rock for a little bit until he kind of got his sanity back, and then he'd attempt to develop some more. But despite all that, the target didn't move. It just sort of sat there. And we knew, okay, that's going to be on a desk somewhere, and it's going to be about this size, and that's really all we had to worry about. That's not the world we live in now. We live in a world today full of all sorts of these little rectangles of glass. And there are all sorts of different shapes and sizes and resolutions, and we have to deal with that. We have what I'm sort of referring to as this deluge of devices. It is an unprecedented number of client devices that our systems need to now work with. And for a while, we could kind of dictate terms a little bit. That's over. We can no longer say this site optimized for, because our customers will just go to our competitors then. And say, okay, that's fine. We'll spend our money somewhere else. We don't need to give it to you. So that's really the challenge for us today, is to sort of figure out how do we handle that. Now I'm going to throw some stats at you guys here this morning, and it isn't because I feel like I need to convince you. It's that I know in my experience